go ahead and get started here and talk about standard MIDI file for MIDI 2.0. So as you all know, of course, MIDI 1.0 had a standard MIDI file from around 1988, I believe. And this allowed for moving MIDI data between devices in standard MIDI. And we feel that the need was obviously also in MIDI 2.0. However, we have a different format for the data. So in standard MIDI filed for 1.0, we had type 0 files and type 1 files. So type 0 was all the data was on one track, and type 1 allowed us to put data on multiple tracks. So we basically copied the concept into MIDI 2.0. Using UMP format, we can transport MIDI 1.0 and MIDI 2.0 data in one track in a MIDI clip file, which is an existing specification already. This has been published. And in a MIDI container format, which is something we have already begun work on and will continue to work on in the course of the next year or so. So let's talk about what that might look like after we talk about MIDI clip file. So a MIDI clip file is in 3 parts. So there's a header, basically a magic number that identifies that it is a MIDI clip file, and then there's a configuration section. This works like the setup bar in a typical SMF type 1 file. This sets a receiver device to behave in a particularly desired manner. So XG format, general MIDI has sometimes quite elaborate setup bars to configure receivers. In the MIDI clip file format, we have an entire section dedicated to this function called a configuration header. And then after that, we have the actual sequence data for a clip file. So a start of MIDI clip and an end of MIDI clip. And this is where the UMP data for notes and controllers and things like that will go. And that's quite it. That's it, basically, for a MIDI clip file. So quite simple way of transporting UMP data. In the MIDI container file, which is going to be analogous roughly to our SMF type 1 file, multi-track file, but goes further in the types of data we might be able to transport. We'd have a pool of clips, of MIDI clip files that was just shown in the last slide. Something like a manifest, which indicates what that pool of data is, and then the tracks onto which the clips and other media types might be placed. Something like this. It's the basic concept. So in addition to MIDI clip files, we would like to be able to transport most obviously notation data, for example, in music XML format. Other media, most obviously audio data, but it might be picture data or video data. Anything that you might want to bundle together as a complete multimedia interchange format based around MIDI. So the most obvious applications for our purpose are going to be in the content and publishing space, education, including education, for sure. So we can include MIDI 2.0 messages in the configuration header of clips for copyrights and publisher song name, performer names, etc., in a very standardized way. These are all MIDI 2.0 messages, and they can be transmitted as part of the clip data because these are now full-fledged UMP messages. They are not metadata as they were in the olden days. We'll be able to use MIDI CI profiles in the configuration header of the UMP clip files, of the MIDI clip files, and this will help configure receivers in a very standardized way. So common examples would be using the piano profile, which is forthcoming, hopefully not too long from now. Could be used for performance and education purposes. General MIDI 2.0 profile to set up a general MIDI 2 device. Orchestral articulation profiles, which will go a long way to help configure standardized behavior of a receiver to render articulation data correctly. And I believe that is it for the actual basic set of slides that we have where we're going forward. So the The possibility for a future container file, some proposals have been to use the open container format, EPUB, as a way of structuring a zip file. So using an XML for the manifest section of the EPUB to point to all of the clip data and other media types in it. But there's other ways of doing it. We could use JSON or something like that in a zip file to perform that function of a manifest. So I think that's probably it for the kind of overview or where we're going with the container format and the kinds of applications we can see it performing in the coming years as an interchange, and also functioning for publishing and content and education. Mike, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's significant that in this MIDI clip file and in this container format, things that used to be metadata are now MIDI messages, so they can be transmitted with the data. So for example, if you have in a standard MIDI file 1, you could place lyrics and other content like copyrights and so on, but they were only in the file. So the application that opened the file would have access to that data, but it couldn't be sent to the devices. Now all of that data could be transmitted along with the musical data. And so I think that's a significant change. A MIDI 2.0 is what has allowed that, because in MIDI 1.0, we were basically out of space for new messages. And in MIDI 2.0, we opened up the walls to a lot more space for more messages. So we've been able to define all of these messages as native MIDI messages so that they can be sent over the wire. And so there's a very powerful lyric mechanism that we've defined. So your standard MIDI files, MIDI clip files, can include lyrics and can include multiple lyrics. You can have the lyrics for the lead singer and separate lyrics for backup vocals. And we also have possibility for Ruby lyrics. Ruby is when you've got multilingual. Sometimes there's hints on the language, and so it's used a lot in Korea, Japan, China, where karaoke is common. And so standard MIDI files. Now all of this is MIDI 2.0 native data. Wow, that was not good. And so I think that's a significant change with MIDI 2.0, just the space to add all of these things and be able to communicate them.
Thanks, Mike. I don't know what's happening here with my mic, getting a little bit too close to the monitor. I don't really have anything to add to that. I know that there are other existing. What? Oh, you can have more. I was going to talk a little bit about we know that there's other ongoing
I'll come back to it. Do that. I'll come back to other things.
Okay, so I don't know if you can hear me or not. Hopefully, so good. Okay, so we understand that there's Bitwig and Presonus have recently announced a project called DA Project, which allows for a kind of interchange format between DAWs. And their focus is for music production applications, so that there's sort of an open-sourced interchange format between DAWs that's focused on music production. So MIDI data, plug-in kind of data, and audio files. What they don't handle currently is also concurrent synchronization of, say, notation files or video files, or really arbitrarily anything additional media types. So it's not really a publishing format or well suited towards publishing, which the SMF2 container format is probably better suited towards publishing and education, rendering on targeted devices, and they seem to be a little more focused on the music production application.
And one of the major areas of business opportunity or applications for this in publishing is education. And with all of the new MIDI messages we've added, we're allowing things that are educational that MIDI 1.0 didn't do. So musical interpretation, or the intention of notes, and the ability to tie notation to the MIDI file. So when you perform, MIDI is kind of an abstraction of the actual music, and sheet music is also an abstraction of the music itself. And the two sometimes don't align depending on how the player plays. You might write something out as quarter notes, but because of the expression by the musician, they don't come out exactly as quarter notes. And so we want to work on the tie between those things so that that note that starts a little bit before beat 2, contextually we want to be able to say it's actually beat 2, even though it started just a little bit before it. So tying the notation and the MIDI data into one file is going to be a powerful thing. Other things like that we've built around this, I mentioned lyrics, but also chord data and key. So with the MIDI message, we could declare, here's a note, but that note is in context of this particular chord. And also in this particular key, or this tonal mode. So I'm in this mode, and the central tonic is this particular note. And so that helps us interpret more than MIDI 1.0 the meaning of these notes. And so these are the things we've been doing, and MIDI 2.0 has expanded this whole world. And the Standard MIDI file allows us to put all of that in and deliver it in publishable form. We can go to Q&A if you like.
Yeah, I think we can go to Q&A if you like. It's time. If we can hear. If anybody has
Check. If anyone has any questions, please put your hand up and I'll be happy to bring the mic over.
Is there any support for something like piano fingering? Like you mentioned, you're adding things beyond.
We're in discussions now on piano fingering. In the MIDI Association, we're nearing the completion of a piano profile for how the piano works. And in fact, we did a demonstration here for the very first time 2 days ago or yesterday, I can't remember now, it's all a blur, of the piano profile in action. And one of the things we wanted to put in the piano profile, indeed, was fingering. But we decided to put that into a next phase. So we will have a fingering solution within this year. And the cool thing about MIDI 2.0 is once we define that, it'll automatically become part of the standard MIDI file, MIDI Clip File, because everything is just a MIDI event in these files. And so it'll be easy for us to add fingering, and it's our intention to do so and define that this year.
You mentioned something about arbitrary data being put into the file. Is this something that developers will be able to create their own protocols within the file to transmit?
Yeah, go ahead. You want to riff on that? Or?
Sure. So the container format can take any file you want to put in there. So if a DAW wants to put private data that relates to how that DAW works, they can put that in there. And then if you want, you can the file should be at least in the manifest. But if you wanted to say something about that data, the manifest is also open, so you could add things into that. The manifest is probably an XML file, although it could be a JSON file. We haven't really determined that yet. But key value pairs, you can put your own data in. And so this will be an open file format where you can include your custom data and then say something about it in the manifest.
Out of curiosity, do you have an idea of the kinds of things you might like to do?
Yeah. Well, no, actually. Let's say I work in a field of developing for performers, and so their needs are ever changing. And so we're just thinking about, when some artist says, oh, I want to do this, X, Y, Z, it's like, okay, well, can I write something that's going to carry over for I can make a file and they can load it on their computer and boom, everything's done.
Yeah, I'm sort of just riffing on that idea. It could be like robotics control or something,
Just one other spin on that is, especially if that data wants to be time synchronized with the contents of the standard MIDI file, MIDI 2 adds a bunch of new rich arbitrary data types, not just the old 7-bit system exclusive. There's a new 8-bit system exclusive that's much easier to work with. And then for large dumps, a mixed data set. So it's entirely possible as a manufacturer with a 6X code to do anything you want and have it placed in time in the proper places in those files to sync with the other MIDI data.
Captain Obvious here is sort of, show control along with audio stems, along with the machine control for moving stages could all be contained in a single container format. Whereas now that has to be concurrently synchronized with multiple mechanisms and lots of people.
Yeah, and some of the people who are contributing to these specifications specifically have interest for including video. And so that's something that we'll be studying this year, how video's in there, how it relates to the MIDI data, how it's synchronized. If some of these things interest you as a developer, please join our working group to help us define these. If you have requirements, we would love to hear them, and we'd love to have you volunteer to help us actually define them. And so if that interests you, come and talk to us about how you join the MIDI Association and how you join the working group to participate in defining these things so that the tools do what you need them to do.
Yeah, I'm kind of actually curious on top of my, like how the video data is represented for like the Sphere in Vegas now. So, perhaps in the just thinking of this is kind of a curious question for me, like a homework. How do they do that?
Any other questions? Be creative. Give them hard questions, curveballs. They like that.
Yes. Trick Mike.
Are you planning any sort of streamable format where you may not have all the file ready at the beginning?
Yeah, the MIDI clip file is designed in a way to be streamable. It's just a stream of data with a delta time in between each event, and so there's a lot of products on the market already dealing with standard MIDI file where they play one event and then load the next, and they deal with that. And so even internally inside these pianos and so on where they're using standard MIDI file, streaming is basically what they're doing, direct out of the file, one event at a time. And so the MIDI clip file, we really kept that in mind and streamlined this. So all it is a set of UMP data or MIDI messages with a delta timestamp on each one.
Are these new and improved like MIDI files? Are they going to be taking up more hard drive space, like more data to be in the sessions?
Yeah, so the it's a function of the size of UMP data versus standard MIDI file or a MIDI 1.0 data. So it has that kind of a function. So the UMP data simply is larger data than MIDI 1.0 data. So to represent one-to-one of an SMF1 to an SMF2 MIDI clip file, it would be somewhat larger, not massively, and especially in modern times, but it would be somewhat larger.
Yeah, for example, a note on in MIDI 1.0 is 3 bytes. A note on in MIDI 2.0 is 8 bytes. So that gives you some context. Of course, if you put a video file in your container, then that's a totally different story in terms of size. But the MIDI data itself is, say, 3 times the size of MIDI 1.0.
I was wondering, what will a MIDI 2.0 file look like if it's loaded into a MIDI 1.0 sequencer? I mean, will the MIDI 1.0 sequencer, or will there be some way to access all the other extra data that's in MIDI 2.0 files?
You would need to translate the file. A MIDI 1.0 sequencer will not be able to read MIDI 2.0 clip files. However, the data inside it as MIDI 2 data, anything that has a MIDI 1.0 equivalent, the translation is quite easy. So notes and controllers and so on, and pitch bend and program change, they all translate quite easily to MIDI 1.0. The new things like the copyright and chords and so on, those don't get translated to MIDI 1.0. So a standard MIDI file translator would need to be able to make those into meta events. But the MIDI events where there are equivalents, it's actually an easy translation. Well, thank you for coming. If you got more questions, we're here. Come and grab us. Thank you for coming.